Welcome to the Civa Festival. Indeterminate apparatus. We're talking about quantum, and I'm very, very happy to have three wonderful people here on stage and online. Hello, Rasheedah. It's great to have you. Hi. Rasheedah Phillips, Djamila Grandits, and Nelly Pinkrah. It's wonderful to have you. Rasheedah Phillips, on the one hand, is a co-founder of Black Quantum Futurism, an artist collective that is also part of the Civa exhibition this year. Then Djamila Grandits, we have been working together very closely last year already. Curator from the film sector. Nelly Pinkrah, also, we have been working together last year. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm very excited to hear about Afrofuturities, the manipulation of space-time, and I give the word to you.
Thank you so very much, Eva. Hi, welcome, and good evening also from my side. My name is Djamila Grandits, and I'm a Vienna-based curator, as you just heard, and I had the pleasure to co-curate last year's exhibition with Eva, which was a real pleasure, and it's beautiful to be back here at the festival, but also at the space. The cinema is really dear to me. Thanks for coming and being here. We will be talking about Afrofuturities and manipulation of space-time, as you heard, weaving into the festival topic of indeterminate apparatus, which was the framework for the entire festival and also the exhibition. And I would like to introduce our speakers and panelists to you. So we are immensely grateful and happy to be able to introduce Rasheedah Phillips to you. Rasheedah, thank you very much for taking the time. It's very early in LA. We appreciate you getting up and sharing time and space with us. My mic is still on. Okay, sorry. Rasheedah is a queer housing advocate, a parent, a writer, an interdisciplinary artist and cultural producer who uses web-based projects, zines, short film, archival practices, experimental non-fiction, speculative fiction, printmaking, performance, social practice, installation, and creative research to explore the construct of time, temporalities, and community futurism through a Black futurist cultural lens and experience. And earlier this year, Rasheedah published a book called Dismantling the Master's Clock on Race, Space and Time at AK Press. And you can find the publication downstairs in the library of the exhibition. Big recommendation to delve into it if you find a moment. Rasheedah is also part of Black Quantum Futurism, as we heard, an LA-based collective that was founded in 2014 by Kamei Ayeva and Rasheedah Phillips as an interdisciplinary creative practice, and the texts, films, and performances draw on diverse sources such as quantum physics and Afro-diasporic cultural traditions. Black Quantum Futurism uses the artistic manipulation of space and time to create speculative futures in a practice of world making. And Black Quantum Futurism is, as we heard, part of this year's exhibition too, with the work Right No History that we will hear more about in a minute. But before we do so, I want to say hi and thank you for being here to Nelly Pinkrah. It's a real pleasure to share this conversation with you. Nelly Pinkrah is a Black media studies scholar currently at the chair of digital cultures at the Technical University of Dresden, and her work explores Black studies, media and technology, poetics and politics, and critical pedagogies. And her doctoral thesis is titled Edouard Glissant and the Poetics of the Technological Everyday, exploring through Edouard Glissant in relation to language, as technology in relation into the varied writing of glissants such as history, cybernetics, and epistemology. And Nelly co-runs the project School of Unthought with Mitch Pfeiffer, and which is also part of the international network A-School. And she's part of the Speakers Circle of the Alliance for Critical Scholarship in Solidarity, a member of the German Forum Anti-Racism Media Studies, and the DFG network Gender Media Effect, and is affiliated with the Center of Digital Cultures at Leuphana University. Thanks so much for being here and taking the time. Nelly has also been a recurring guest here at Civa, contributing with conversations last year, and also contributed a wonderful article to last year's publication in the catalog. So if you want to look that up, feel free to talking about maybe also some of the topics that we will tackle today. Yes. So we were just saying that Rasheedah's work, or Black Quantum Futurism's work, is part of the exhibition. And when planning this conversation, we thought it would be beautiful to depart from that very work that some of you might have seen earlier today, or that you can interact with within the next days. It's a 3-channel video installation, a very poetic, essayistic approach, and it's backed by a panel with quotes. And the text from the exhibition says that Right Now History draws on found and archived photographs, documents, and other materials of the so-called temporal disruptors who make up the protagonists of those very videos and interactions that you can engage with in those 3 different but yet very entangled stories that are connected through objects, aspects that transcend those 3 screens and kind of like connect maybe and encapsulate certain aspects and questions. There are time capsules that are being buried and unburied. There are objects that serve as portals, and there are rituals that those disruptors engage in alone, solitary, but also in community, depending on what aspect you engage with in the 3 screens. So, Rasheedah, would you mind sharing what your departure point was for this work, or maybe also when having a conversation with the curatorial team of this year's exhibition, how Right Now History was an entry point that for you was relevant or made sense in this very collaboration?
Yeah, thank you. And hello, everybody. Thanks for having me virtually. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you really well.
Great. Yeah, so, the point of departure for the short film Right Now History is quite a few different things that came together to entangle and sort of, film being sort of the best medium, I think, for those 3 things to be expressed in various ways. The first point is really over many years of time, I've been researching a lot about different types of time capsules, and have had different types of workshops with different kinds of people and communities around what do time capsules for their communities look like? How do their particular communities hold memory? And in that holding of memory, how does it defy sort of the linearity of the ways that we think of time capsules, which is that it's something that travels directly from the past into the future? How do we, disrupt that sort of linearity within time capsules? Because that sort of linearity and the timelines that are often placed into the sort of traditional time capsules are ones that exclude Black histories generally, and exclude certain types of histories. And so, it was that, and then it was also the temporal disruptors who are featured in the short film began as a project of looking at the different types of Black women scientists and healers and technologists who have been, again, locked out of history, erased from particular types of timelines. The film sort of basically imagines those folks, those folks who have been able to drop into different timelines, disrupt, their erasure from the future, and emerge in different ways. It depicts that, but it also depicts them sort of playing playing with this idea of the time capsule as something that can be a technology. If we're thinking about Black temporalities, it can be a technology that reaches back into the past instead of just this linear flow from the past to the present to the future. And so the film depicts that. It depicts, temporal disruptors being able to reach back into the past, being able to bury a time capsule from the future that ancestors can utilize, that has tools that they can use to shape their present, shape the past, shape the future. So it's really some of those ideas, and it shows sort of a taxonomy of real lifetime capsules that I've been able to research and find. And so there's an essay that accompanies the Write No History film that actually came before the film that talks about these different types of time capsules that have emerged in Black communities, particularly ones that are found under things like housing projects, or you might call them housing estates in Europe, but like low income spaces where people live, particularly Black people, time capsules that have been found buried underneath those spaces, or time capsules that are a part of different burial practices that Black communities have held. So it's really creating that different categorization or taxonomy of what a time capsule can be and how it can be a tool to intervene instead of one that just upholds a timeline that often excludes particular types of people. And then as far as how it got into the exhibition, that was really, the curators were really interested in the film and how it relates to the themes of the exhibition. So that was more their choice than mine.
Thank you so much for letting us in on that. I'm also really interested in the fact that those time capsules, as you say, are carriers of memory, and they're also proof and witnessing, so to say, but there's also some sort of inscription into the land that is happening through the burial. So it's also an inscription of reality and presence into a landscape and into the physical earth that often denies that very presence. Was that an aspect that was relevant for you too?
Oh yeah, definitely. And you put it beautifully. I think you read my bio, and folks may know I'm a housing advocate and a land justice advocate. I've been an attorney in the past life. Now I don't practice law, but I still do land justice work. And yeah, space and time. My creative work focuses a lot on time, but it is very much entangled with space. And the book that I write is about space and time. And so it is challenging, and space in its many forms, whether it's outer space or it's space on the ground, in the ways that we are spatialized or are able to engage with our spatial environments. And so that connection to indigenous, Black indigenous, Native American indigenous, other types of indigeneity, and those relationships to land that many of us are trying to revive because of the ways that we've been pushed off, denied, had land stolen from us, had our relationships disrupted, those relationships that were very much a part of our everyday life and seeing the land as a living being. So it's definitely going back to, it is definitely making those connections very intentionally.
Yeah, thank you very much for expanding also on the dimension of space. I have one last question about the work before we maybe also then connect it to your work, Nelly. The wall panel behind the video installation features quotes around CPT, which is on the one hand an abbreviation for colored people's time, which was also a derogative term for the stereotype of Black people always being late, and an exclusive mechanism in all kinds of institutional settings, whereas on the other hand it is change parity time, which is a principle in quantum technology. And I was wondering about the correlation of those two concepts and how you bring them together. And yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of what the timeline is again challenging, as with all of the work, is the actual nonlinearity of history. And again, history in particular kinds of circles is often packaged and given to us in this very neat cause and effect sort of manner. And that cause and effect, the way that we as social beings think about it in our reality, is sort of legitimized by science, which tells us, you know, a certain category of science, classical theory tells us, right, that time can move only in one direction, right? And that's what we think that we experience when we think about it. And so this is really challenging that it's challenging that there's a neat history around anything really, and that there's like these sorts of entanglements that can happen. And I did that by tracing the history of how time has been regarded in Black communities, right? And connecting it back to histories that have been disparate or taken away from that fuller picture. And so when you talk about colored people's time and that word is used, right, it very much is a stereotype and it's derogatory, but it traces back. It has a very specific history, right? And it's not just a social behavior of Black people, right? It's something that has been inscribed into our beingness based on, you know, this taxonomy that was put upon us as Black people when we were enslaved about our positionality in time, right? Black people, particularly those across the diaspora, have been seen as people who are outside of time, people who don't belong on the timeline of progress because we're so behind. And so it's just really troubling that, troubling where this idea of CP time comes from, and then sort of entangling it back with that history of science that actually shows us that the unidirectional nature of time is only one way to look at, experience, see time. If you look at it from the quantum perspective, if you look at it from the perspective of very small things, time actually does run backwards and forwards. Time does do strange things that aren't just linear cause and effect moving from past to the future. So it's really just bringing in and entangling those different kinds of concepts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's also very much resonating with the stretching of rigid time spaces, where maybe also carving out a little time can be like strong act of resistance and liberation in a fixed system that you might have to comply to in order to survive. Nelly, I would like to bridge to you here. We were already talking slightly about notions of futurities, of nonlinearity in time, but also ancestral technologies, as some of the objects are featured. But then, Rasheedah, you referred to the time capsules as technologies themselves. And I was wondering, in your research practice that is always also very much informed by and entangled with your political practice, how are notions of ancestral technologies and questions of futurities relevant, and what forms do they take?
Yes, so hi everyone. I haven't spoken yet. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I will speak maybe first on ancestral technologies before I go into the rest, because I think that it helps maybe for a conversation, also for the audience to get a little bit into what I mean when I talk about such things, right? So can you hear me well as well? Yeah. Wow, that was a synchronized nod. Okay. Yeah, so I want to start with the term of technology, and for those of you with whom I was in a meeting earlier today, there will be some repetition, I guess. But yeah, so my work is largely focusing around kind of excavating that term and deconstructing it and really thinking through the ways in which technology has been thought, what that did, in what kind of constellation that occurred, what that made possible, what it what it made impossible, and, you know, these things. And so I think that the term technology is really in a state of, let's call it insecurity in some way. I think that there is a rather stable understanding of it that we have in our world today, where we would kind of, you know, connect it to a certain geography, a certain also type of human maybe. I talk about Silicon Valley, I talk about a specific type of technological imagination that is kind of tethered to that. I talk about a specific type of imagination of a future that, you know, automatically comes with this, which is problematic and dangerous for a ton of reasons. And so kind of the consequence that came out of that for me was to first and foremost think through the histories of technology that we have and that we narrate, right? So, and this already, I guess, taps into all kinds of different topics that already are out on the table at the moment, because this has to do with the way in which history is narrated in the first place, and how we think of that, right? So if we think that historiography is a field and a practice that can stay true to its own implications, for example, there is tons of work. For example, there's a very known, I think, work by Hayden White, who has this book that is called Meta History, and he basically makes us understand that all historical writing is following some type of genre of writing, right? So it can be tragic, it can be comedy, whatever it is. But that already also implies that there's a way in which we can actually talk about history, that there is historical fact or an event, and then there is a narration of it, but maybe there's always already the narration only, because that's the only way we can access it in some type of way. Of course, we can also experience it, but then we would have to kind of dissect the ways in which experience is also tethered to already the performing of it in some ways, right? So that would be like one aspect, and so histories of technology have to do with that. It also has to do with the question, who has historically been allowed to produce anything that we now call technology? And we can trace that, and that's very limited, and that has, certain effects. And so, yeah, if we talk about ancestral technologies, this could go many directions, because I could kind of try and stay true to the definition that we have. And then I have a very specific, very limited and reductive understanding of what technology is, and how that applies to our everyday lives now. Or I can try and broaden this term and this definition to make it actually attend to the ways in which we are in this world, I guess. And that's what I'm trying to do, of course. Yes, and so I think there are many, many, many examples of these kinds of technologies. I think that the term ancestral is a very intimate term, and that it can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I have my very own kind of relationship to that term and to what it means, what ancestry means to me, and it has to do with the histories that we have to inhabit. So already that all of what I'm saying is a loop in a loop in a loop in a loop, as you can, yeah. And so, yeah, I have written this dissertation that you mentioned, where I have a whole chapter that's just called History and Archive. And I go through like different settings and sites, but maybe just to mention one thing that is interesting would be, for example, the tradition of, I mean, I could choose now from like many, many different things. I don't want to make this too long. So, let's go to the tradition of griot in Western Africa, which is close to me because I have ancestry in Western Africa. And it is so interesting because the griot is, we could call it an operator if we wanted to talk in terms of the contemporary, I guess. In a certain time, the griot would be called maybe a storyteller, or, there would be different kinds of terms that would be used, and this has always to do with the time and the space in which you name something, right? So now, provocatively, I would say it's an operator. The griot is an operator of many different genres, and what the griot does is actually performing history, and there's no other way of accessing any history in that tradition. And the griot operates different genres because there's performance, but there's also the connecting to ancestry. There is so many different kinds of modularities, I guess, that I think it makes a lot of sense to call the griot an operator, for example. And so that would be just like one way of talking about ancestral technologies. There's this wonderful film that is called AI, African Intelligence by Mantia Diawara. He taps a little bit into these things, which is super interesting. And maybe we come back to that later, because this has also a lot to do with the figure of the medium and how that actually really has to do with a lot of what we have to grapple with today in terms of how we relate to certain media that are somewhat seem spectral to us, or have a certain aura or stuff like that, which we could also kind of likened, for example, to the idea of an AI that we have to speak to and stuff like that, you know. So this was very long, but maybe for a start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm stuck on the griot because I'm thinking a lot about how, if seen as an operator, as a medium, with a very strong subjectivity, with a deep also ancestral legacy, as it's really also a societal function that is passed on through ancestry, it also already contains the futurity of it as and in a way it operates like one of those time capsules, but in a relational manner, maybe, so to say, much more than in an in an indexical one. And those narrative modes or ways of channeling that, as you say, range from performative acts to classical storytelling, but also to consulting functions. If people need to find out certain things about their family, if there's consultation needed, if there's a narration needed within a community context, there's so many functions that operator can take that are always linked to futurities, because oftentimes it's about decision making, but they're also always informed by the past or an ancestry of the consulted person, but also the ancestry that has this sacred knowledge of the griots that is always passed on by those lineages. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And I think it also already kind of like weaves into the next question, because we were talking about it like briefly earlier, how Afro-diasporan configurations and realities were always networked and relational, long preceding network technologies like the internet. And we know well that thinkers, artists, and minds like Kudwo Eshun or Jano Komfra have coined those technologies of connectivity, but also disconnectivity that is very much entangled with a history of violence. But it's also a great gift or a way of being in this maybe encapsulated world that through the disparity is always in connectivity. So I was wondering how that aspect is relevant to your research and also to your practice when thinking about technology and maybe also future technologies.
Thank you for the question, yeah. Yeah, sorry, yeah, there's so many aspects. Maybe I'll start by saying that I think sometimes, you know, when we say stuff like something prefigures or it's like the proto or, you know, it kind of defies the, like we can only define it ever then in the relation to that what is now, right? So if we say that something prefigured the internet, it is only defined in the relation to that, and then we become kind of stuck on the idea of what that, for example, the internet as a networked space can be, and already have limited what we actually wanted to open up, I guess, you know. And so that's why I'm like trying to think through that. But yeah, I think, I mean, there's so many great examples to like the question you're asking. So I think, for example, what would be interesting is like Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, right? He basically says or articulates the ship, I guess, as like the first distributed network. And I think we can push that even a little bit more and think about like what distribution means when it's not, you know, what we understand what it is now, like, for example, telecommunication or whatever. But rather, in that specific instance, it is something else. It is bodies in motion. It is bodies existing under the worst conditions imaginable in his specific example, right? And I think what network there means is like the body as medium and flesh, right? And absolutely stripped down of any humanity ever imaginable. And its fungibility as well. It's what Saidiya Hartman describes. And so these are so many different kinds of articulation of what that can be that we I think this is also what Black Studies does. we excavate that, and then we have to deal with that. It's there. This is reality and has been reality for a lot of people, and then we have to kind of think what that means in this world, where we also, of course, think other things, but we also have to think through things like that. Yeah, and I mean, I said this already, but I think that certain metaphors, we need to think them, or metaphors, I mean terms, but metaphors, we need to think them outside of and beyond that which we can relate it to now. I think that's quite important, and that's one of the things that I try to do in my work, and also that counts for my, I guess, more academic or, yeah, whatever, but my writing, and also for the work that I do outside of writing, and that is more practice-based or praxis-based, I guess, and maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, thanks for also opening up, once again, the entanglement to violence, and I think we were talking about violence earlier today in two different settings, actually, with you, and I think I meant less of a prefiguration to what is now, because even what is now as a distributed network technology is not something particularly stable. But if we think of distributed blackness, as you say, and we take it from Gilroy, and then it makes me think of Christina Sharp and The Wake and The Hold, and it also makes me think of Legacy Russell, who's thinking about what distributed blackness can mean in relation to the black meme and circulation of images online, or Aria Dean, who also tangles those very aspects of violence that are inscribed in the ambiguity also of distribution and networkedness, and also publicness, so to say, that are extremely violent and also extremely entangled with the violence of white spectatorship to this content. But maybe I can loop it also back to you, Rasheedah. If you think about ancestral technologies and futurities, as your work also has so many different iterations, the artistic practice that articulates in very poetic forms and very different mediums, but also the political practice, how is this a motive, and how do you formally channel it?
Yeah, I think a lot of my work, well, first, I really appreciated the discussion around technology and how it could either sort of be used reductively or expansively. And I think the way that we think about technology in our work is based on sort of the etymological meaning of technology, which is, meaning it breaks down to art, skill, craft, a system, a system or method of making or doing, right? And it doesn't have, in its sort of original sense, any specific connection to form or medium, right? So I think we try to think about that in our work. And, again, how a time capsule, in its different forms can be a form of technology, can be a form of doing the same things that we, in a modern sense, think of as technologies, how they were doing, whether it's as was said through the griot or other sort of practices that come up in the, the griot functioned as a form of technology for sure, as a form of, as a system, as a way of connecting, information. So yeah, we just try to think of it in those various forms. A lot of my work, the conversation around violence also really struck me because of how violence shows up in the sort of work that I do as a housing policy person. For a long time, I've represented people who were facing really violent circumstances in terms of being evicted from their homes, and how that process is both extremely physically violent, being displaced from both your actual home, but then also it has a form of generational violence in terms of how it impacts a family that is displaced, pushed out, ripped from their home, particularly in a very short period of time, right? And I think about that in my work a lot in terms of like entering into these court systems, and what my job is as a lawyer is to, quite frankly, manipulate time. manipulate time for my client to get them more time in their home, or to make for a better transition if they are being kicked out. So just, yeah, I was reflecting on that as you all were talking about the sort of violences that show up, and how time can compound that if it's used in this sort of particular way, and how it has been used over time as a form of punishment directly, for against Black bodies. Whether we're talking about its physical manifestation, particularly in terms of enslavement, and how, the very aspect of the kind of labor that enslaved Black people had to do was all mediated by this sense of time, by the sense of the master's clock and that time on into the present, right? And even how we think about time in sort of the prison industrial complex, the violence of time in that space where people are, imprisoned and they're literally doing time, to the sort of times that, again, I see in my work as a housing attorney, and how that those timelines mediate actually who gets to access the so-called future, in very, pernicious ways, whether it's an eviction record that follows them for the rest of their lives due to so-called technology, right, that keeps these kinds of records open and accessible. And so, yeah, the work I do also as a housing advocate thinks about what are the counter technologies that can, kick back against, the sort of perniciousness of these kinds of things that are, again, just a part of everyday people's lives. Particularly people who are low income. And again, the violence comes from all various aspects, right? Like I see one aspect of it around housing, but when we talk about employment, when we talk about access to food, access to all sorts of things, particularly in America, and it's getting worse and worse, right? So yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but those were some of the things that came up as you all were talking, and I'm really interested in reading this book, Meta History. So thank you for sharing that, because I want to get it today.
Sure.
Just because it fits so well, and it's also a repetition from earlier, but Rasheedah, just because you talked about the clock specifically, right? And then doing time, like for people in prison, which in German would be, Zeitabsitzen or whatever, but... and I kind of want to connect that also to how basically histories and historical experience leak into each other, or like how so many different things are somewhat interlinked intimately that we would not maybe on first glance identify as that or whatever. And I mentioned this in the earlier meeting already, but I have a text where I start from a very different kind of approach to technology, namely in its very violent iterations. And I start from a machine that is called the whipping machine that was used in the plantation economy, and I think through the labor relations basically that occurred. I'm saying this because I was at a conference a couple years back where Fred Moten gave a keynote, and he said the sentence, from the whipping machine comes the drum, or out of the drum comes the whipping machine. Sorry, that was an inversion. Out of the whipping machine comes the drum, sorry. And I sat there, and then, he gave his keynote, and I was like, what does that even mean? And like, it stuck, and I researched and found that this whipping machine was a real thing. It's super violent and horrendous. And, but I tried to think through that thing, and through the kind of environment, or the kind of, I have to basically speak in Christina Sharp's terms. I had to think through the atmosphere, right, that it created, which was a very particular, very violent soundscape that was repeated noises that you can all imagine. I don't have to, I'm just invoking it, which is already so violent. And then we think about the drum, and then we think about what are we actually thinking about. We're thinking about the clock. At some point, we're thinking about the clock because we are in a labor environment out of which came capitalism. And this is interesting because there's a historian who's called Edward Baptiste, and he wrote a book that is called The Half Has Never Been Told. And he basically, the whole argument of the book, and it's an incredible historical study. There's incredible data and all kinds of different sources in there. And what he does is say, this has never been basically inquired like this, or like no one has ever dared to formulate it like this, but American capitalism, how we know it, has come from the technologization of torture. It was so systematized that when it became something that was so normalized, American capitalism basically hit off. And one of the things that got American capitalism there was the whipping machine, but Edward Baptiste uses it as a metaphor and basically calls the whole system, the whole operation, the whole machine of torture, the whipping machine. But actually it was a physical thing. So I'm just invoking this to say that, and now if we hear the clock, or now if we, you know what I mean, like I'm talking about a specific soundscape and how specifically in Black studies, people try to make sense of such things and how these lineages kind of, you know, grow out of each other and also diverge and also come back again and, you know, these loops again. And so I just wanted to kind of, yeah.
No, thank you very much. And I think as we were talking about also the translatability, geographically or location-wise, European capitalism is as much based on torture and enslavement, and I think it's just a parallel that has a bit of a divergence in the timelines, but even like in a linear historical understanding precedes that takeoff and already instituted all those kind of mechanisms. Thank you for also offering the rhythm of violence, so to say. And Rasheedah, I think it very much bridges also in what you're doing in your book when you're saying in Dismantling the Clock, you're trying to understand time as a liberatory resource rather than a tool of oppression, really delving into what Black space-time matters could the transformative framework, but obviously you also depart from the very violent contextualization of how time has violently structured lives, and particularly Black lives, from a very oppressive and system. Yeah, and I was wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit also as you develop 4 principles that you with quantum futurism that inform the introductory chapter of your book, where you kind of lay out principles in relation to time as a reparative and transformative framework.
Yeah, I think part of, you know, what the book is doing, and just, yeah, what my practice and the tools that we've developed are doing, is taking time and the clock itself from this realm of being seen as this sort of neutral, objective object, and mediation that is, you know, it's there, you know, the calendar, the clock, we take it for granted as objective, as the truth, as the nature of reality, and just simply move it away from that into a subjective space and something that can be used. And I don't think the work is necessarily attempting to heal all of time, right? And see it as, you know, I think we try to acknowledge there is still a violence to time. Like, even if you are able to sort of use it creatively and reclaim it in some way, there still is an inherent violence to how it's used and how the mechanisms that are so embedded in our culture around, again, who has access to the future, who gets to control the future. So in a lot of ways, my work is just about pointing to that and discussing it and sort of trying to do harm reduction, if you will, around time. And I think, you know, speculative practice is really important here. And, you know, for me as a person trained in law, right, both law and speculative practice have a lot in common. Because ultimately it's about how we can structure reality in some ways. Like, law attempts to codify what is possible, and speculative practice imagines what could be possible, right? And those two things entangle in some way. And so, like, speculative practice is really important to me, particularly as a descendant of Black American chattel slavery, and a person who's not able to easily, if at all, really access the so-called objective truth of the histories of my family. Speculation is a completely really valid tool for me to sort of imagine and to be able to make those connections both in the past and in the future. And so, again, in speculative work, it's for us, it's about creating openings to disrupt sort of those timelines, whether it's through community archives, oral futures, sort of making nonlinear maps of memory, and sort of navigating the tensions between those things. I try also to use legal tools to carve to sort of think through the tensions of those things. As I said, in my practice as a lawyer, so much of it was about mediating time, manipulating time, and again, I think that has a lot to do with speculation and how speculative tools can be used to sort of imagine long-term liberation. And again, sometimes it's just about, the speculation is about rewriting the official record, using our own memories, using our own visions, our own experiences to rewrite and disrupt that official record. And again, that doesn't necessarily erase or heal, right, what has happened, but right, it's a pathway, it's an opening. I don't know if I answered the question specifically, but.
You totally did, and there's two things you offered that I want to pick up on. First of all, I said to Nelly earlier, I find it really fascinating, beautiful, and valuable how you translate and mediate through those very many different disciplines, and you pick up an abbreviation, a concept, and you translate it from one to the other that actually interweaves and relates all those practices really beautifully. So thank you for doing so on the one hand, and also to the speculative approach. There's a prior publication by Rasheedah from 2014 that is actually speculative writing that you can also find downstairs in the library, so have a look. And I would like to take the offer of fabulation and speculation and pass it on to you, Nelly, because I think it's also something that plays a big role in your research practice. And I think instituting fabulation and speculation into research is already a quite political act by itself. And I was wondering how you deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. I would probably say that I actually don't do a lot of it, but I think through why it's absolutely necessary and why actually all history writing is somewhat connected to it, at least, or is just that also, which has to do with what I said earlier already. But so I think, what struck me, or what I think became super clear through what Rasheedah said was that, to me, what is super important if we talk about speculation or fabulation is that as basically a practice, that it, like, to me, it's not really valuable if it doesn't kind of fold back into a material practice, right? Which I think is super important, and which I think just came through a lot through what Rasheedah said, actually. Because I think if it doesn't do that, then it becomes a sort of, I have to think of Sylvia Wynter's work and like the overrepresentation of a specific type of genre of human, and that's exactly what would happen, right? Because if it does not fold back into material practice, then it is just another kind of grand narrative, just another kind of, what we already have, I would say. And so that, to me, counts for speculation as well as for fabulation. And I mean, Sadiya Hartman said, it's critical fabulation, there's a term. And even, I would say, especially in today's time, we're to connect it to, some of the contemporary discourses, right? But, post-truth and so on and so forth, evacuation of fact and so on and so forth. I don't think it's very valuable to just talk about fabulation and then have people fabulate shit, because there's a very specific historical necessity for a specific community or group of people in that, what we're talking about now, is an Afro-American experience where there is literally no record of ancestry, history, anything. So it becomes a necessity to think through why there needs to be a writing of history that can kind of, how do you say, take that up. That's not a good way to put it, but you all know what I mean. So I think that's the first thing that is super important to me if we talk about speculation or critical fabulation. That's one thing. My dissertation is about Edouard Glissant, like all of his work. He has produced a ton of work in, he wrote novels, poetry. There's a lot of essayistic theoretical writing. He was editor-in-chief of the UNESCO Courier for over 6 years, where he produced a lot of more policy, actually, oriented work, which I also delve into, and so there is a lot. And he also wrote a play, which is very important and interesting, about the Haitian Revolution. I'm saying this because in this play, on like there are many editions, but like on one of the editions, first page, he talks about a prophetic vision of the past, and I love that phrase. I love it a lot, and that also comes from that experience of the Middle Passage. He was from Martinique, so all of the Caribbean archipel is, populated with formerly or like. Descendants of formerly enslaved people, and there is a particular kind of necessity to understand what history can mean for these people and how they can build community and what that means, right? And so he talks about that prophetic vision of the past, and I think it's such an interesting and super important kind of concept, I guess, and term. And what I want to say about it is I think that what is so interesting about it is that it really refuses to kind of foreclose what official like history would foreclose and keep that open. But then also there's not like a, let's call it maybe like a romanticism to just kind of replace one totality that we already have with another, right? And so, yeah. Maybe as much on these two terms, which I think are very important. But what I do in my work is really try to, argue for why we have them and why this is not less valuable than a narration of history that is equally, just in different kind of modes, I guess, equally fabricated in that sense. But we have to use the term, of course, very like sensitively and attentively to what we want to mean by it, right? And what it can mean and what not.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think there were two moments, Rasheedah, when you were talking about disruption and rupture, and on the one hand, disrupting the linearities, and you have the disruptors as protagonists also in right now history, but then also in naming that very void of non-traceability of lived experience and the necessity for speculation and critical fabulation, as Sadiya Hartman puts it, comes in. And I was wondering, as it's something that I'm concerned with quite a lot, is this very void? And we were talking about it outside earlier, Nelly, and you made a really point that this conjuncture of those dealings with rupture, void, and in between spaces doesn't happen in a vacuum, but it happens through that very necessity that we are driven by, as in my case, diasporic subjects socialized in a predominantly white society. And I was wondering how those voids, ruptures, and in-betweens maybe also resonate with critical understandings of quantums and the possibilities encapsulated in quantum. Maybe to you, Rasheedah, and how you feel about these dealings with the void, because I think, there's also a critical take one could take to not get stuck, and the necessity to translate into practice on one way or another. But maybe, Rasheedah, can you pick up on this first?
Can you repeat it? I didn't hear the one word you said. White, is that what you're
void,
saying?
Void, rupture and void. Yeah.
Okay, can you re-ask the question? Thank you.
No, I was wondering, because I have the feeling that when we think about ruptures in time, but also in spaces, and especially from marginalized perspectives, they seem like an interesting subject to me on multiple levels. And I was wondering how it resonates with the quantum. So we have an undefined in-between space. We were talking about maybe also connecting it to the break if we think through Moten, or the glitch if we think to Legacy Russell. And I was thinking about it when indeterminate apparatus as festival topic and exhibition topic came up, and when we think about quantum futurism, especially Black Quantum Futurism, is there somewhat of a resonance to you between those spaces and quantum?
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, absolutely. And I talk about this a lot through thinking about the collapse and uncollapse of time and matter, and how in quantum physics, right, what quantum physics tells us in some ways is that things really are not objective, right? And that the observer changes everything. If there's an experiment with a particle, what that particular person observes, right, may change the behavior of that particle. And what that particle is doing when it's not being observed, right, is that it exists in all its possible states and possibilities. It could be a wave, it could be a particle, it could be anything it wants to be, until we observe that thing and then we give it a designation and we fix it in time and we fix it in measurement. And so I use that to parallel to Black people, right, in terms of the just level of surveillance that is placed upon us, throughout time, and how that surveillance, how that watching, how that observation, how that measurement of us collapses us into what is perceived as a single state of being, and it does not allow us to exist in our fullness, our full possibilities. And I talk a lot about, what are the things that are possible when we're not being observed, when we're not being watched. And I think and again, you can relate that back to plantation time and plantation temporalities on up to today. Again, interconnected with the prison industrial complex, interconnected with the sorts of surveillance technologies that mediate, how Black people are seen, what's put on TV in terms of the things that stereotype us and our sort of behaviors and don't allow us to exist in full wholeness, full possibility, full difference amongst us. And I think about that with my work as well, in terms of like, I write, I create these tools that I want to reach a wide audience, but at heart, they are created for Black people, right? They are created based on the Black community and my community and the things that I think are technologies that can support our thriving. And so there is this question of like, how do I put these things out so that they're not observed, that they're not co-opted, that our spaces of possibility aren't just rendered, visible. And I think there is something to be said, and I talk about this in my book, about mediating legibility. I think there is some spaces where we do want legibility, where we do want to be seen, where we do want to be visibilized. And then there are some where we just do not and should not, right? And I don't want our stuff to be legible. So I have to like work with that balance, especially again as we try to create and unbury and bring forth sort of these ancestral technologies and ways of being in time, is how legible, right, and to make it, and how we're contributing to a culture of surveillance that collapses our possibilities into one. So it's just something, it's always a question in the work. But yeah, I think there absolutely is that counterpart to quantum physics when we're talking about voids and where we exist within those kinds of liminal spaces.
Yeah, thank you very much for the image of uncollapsing beyond observation or beyond capture, maybe also to come back to Moten again. I want to pass it on to you, Nelly. What's your take on rupture?
Yes, so I mean, you mentioned already that I think, in structure it's similar to my earlier comment, that I want to understand why this happens, right? There's a conjuncture of this, an interest in like rupture and void and the break and so on and so forth in a particular field, in a particular time and so on. And of course that's interesting and it says something. What it says, I think, there's probably also other things, but I think it comes out of an epistemological necessity, right? That we already invoked somewhat. That is really kind of the recognition of the fact that certain life, and we're talking in this instance about Black life, emerges precisely at the site of kind of ontological catastrophe. And that means something, right? So, and you mentioned Fred Moten. He has this book In the Break, where, I don't want to actually or retell the story that for him is kind of the point of departure of talking about that break, because it's, again, extremely violent. But I think what he's onto and how he then makes sense of that by linking it actually to what I also talked about earlier, like the kind of, it has to do with phonic matter and the kind of sonic, right, realm, is really, really interesting and something that was really lacking before from any kind of production of any kind of theory about how we could make sense of such things. And I mean, I think that this is really about something that for me, in the work Right Now History, for example, what the time capsule does is kind of disrupt a certain logic, right? And to me, this is also what Fred Moten does with the rupture. And if we want to think through these things, so to me, I think what the movement is that happens is a disruption of a certain type of logic that is violent to a majority of people. And I guess what we want to strive for in this world is not be violent against each other. I know that sometimes violence is necessary and sometimes violence occurs and so on and so forth, but it is, if it becomes systematic, if it becomes, you know, if it's a scale that is like, you know, these kinds of things, I guess that's what we don't want to do. And I wanted to say one more thing. I mean, okay, I have to quickly say something about Edouard Glissant, of course, because we're talking about rupture, yeah. And so in his book, Poetics of Relation, Edouard Glissant opens with a chapter that is called The Open Boat. And I just want to kind of put it out there because, I mean, first of all, it's very beautiful, but the kind of imagery that he offers comes from that catastrophe I'm speaking about. But, and I mean, when he wrote it, the original is in French from 1990. That was also a particular kind of conjuncture where people started to think through certain things, and or had been for a while as well. But he came basically out and he had this book, and also in earlier works he talked about the middle passage, and he has this concept of creolization. Basically what he says is that this catastrophe, and he talks about the abyss, and there's many different terminologies for it, but it generated something, which means there was some type of productivity to it, which is a crazy thing to say, of course. And it was in that kind of climate where he did. A lot of people were very angry and said, like, it's just catastrophe, it's that. But of course, if the kind of language that we have exhausts every Black and diasporic experience in this catastrophe, that's also a problem, and that's also violent, of course. And so I think that's why this open boat is also in itself kind of a break or something that offered something new, a kind of new imaginary, and just kind of to grapple with the fact that something came out of it, and what came out of it actually produced our reality, because, I mean, that's where we are now, and so we have to maybe think about that, I guess. And yeah, maybe lastly, quick point, what I do think is really important, because I work a lot, or I have worked a lot with also the history of cybernetics, right? And there was this particular point, there was like a first wave of cybernetics, where the first cyberneticians made sense of certain things and had Macy conferences and came together and talked about a new kind of actually also epistemological paradigm to understand the world. And then there was a moment where there came what is now called basically the second wave, which is second order cybernetics, which was coined by Heinz von Förster, who said, we have thought about all of these things, like systems and communication and so on and so forth in a particular way, but we have never really included ourselves in that. But a system is only observable from the observer point of view. This is a different kind of like iteration and also articulation of the same thing that we're talking about, of course, now. But again, there's conjunctures to things, and they pop up and then die down again for specific reasons. But I do think that there is some overlap, and that this is interesting, because cybernetics was also, people thought it was the new universal science and it would solve any and every social problem. And there was lots of ideas that, you know, we could program socialism, like, you know, and cybernetics would help and so on and so forth. And we have a similar discourse, right, where we think, okay, quantum is now there and we can solve a lot. And I mean, we will see what happens, but this kind of idea of like a universalist approach to stuff, to me, is still problematic, I guess.
No, thank you very much for stressing that, and for earlier also bringing up Glissant. And I think, yes, it's a quite provocative term, but it's also something that gives language to survival and language to legacy that is the fabric of reality, of Black reality. So yeah, thank you very much for that. We're moving towards the end. We nonetheless want to take a question or a comment from the audience. So if there is something you want to contribute, please feel free to join the conversation. Yep. question, comment, unfinished thought, disagreement in the very back on the right.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, don't be shy. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk. And I think, I'm not sure if it's a question or an insight to the both of you, but I think I'd just like to hear more about specifically, you know, what it is that you started with, which is time capsules. And I have here written down how they've been also described throughout the talk as like carriers of memory or also as a form of technology. And I couldn't help but relate to that as to like containment, or just like to me, that's also what I think about when it comes to time capsules, relating also a lot to like Ursula Le Guin's like carrier bag theory of fiction, and how it is that containment or like creating vessels is a form of like ancestral technology that we hold. So I think my question would kind of be like for the both of you, like what is the function of a time capsule when it comes to like preservation, like especially someone who works a lot with like food preservation and just like kind of preservation as a whole of memory, etc. And where does imagination come into this of just kind of like opening up this time capsule, and what does this also serve, and is that also the purpose to open it up? Yeah, so I don't know, lots of thoughts, but just a chain. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's all those things. I mean, when I think of the time capsule, I love what you said about containment, which when you first said containment, I thought of it as a negative thing. And then when you continue to talk about, you know, the creation of these vessels, I was like, okay, I understand. And I think it is both. And I think what I talk about in my book, I have a chapter in my book that goes into at length about what these time capsules are and sort of the thinking and theory behind it. And for what I talk about as quantum time capsules, some of them were never meant to be opened. So again, I sort of think through this other sort of taxonomy, this other categorization, other types of time capsules that for Black people who have a different sort of epistemology and relationship to objects, that it is not necessarily about preservation in the sense that we think about it, or even preservation of a specific or fixed memory. The sort of objects that you might find in a quantum time capsule that, you know, is within a Black cultural context are things that have a utility in the ways that we might not, you know, that for a typical time capsule, right, it's thought of like there's no more utility in the kind of objects that are buried there. These are things from the past, right? Like there's a coin in there or a newspaper that has no like real function in the present world, right? It's supposed to be a snapshot of the past, or at least in American context. Maybe in other contexts it's different. And so what I talk about with the quantum time capsule is that it's not necessarily about preservation. It's not necessarily, you know, the sort of objects that Black people, particularly, I have one part talking about enslaved Black people and the sort of ways that they had to hide these objects that, you know, I see them as a form of time capsule, but they had to hide these kinds of objects that were spiritually based, whether it was like gemstones, certain types of feathers, a piece of a dish, right? They had these little pockets underneath their cabins that held these objects that they would take out of surveillance, take out of the view of the master clock and the master's eye, and use those objects, right? And so it's a form of time capsule. They were kept in the ground, they were buried, and then they were bought out. They weren't preserved for a future generation. They had a utility in the moment. So I talk a lot about that and how that sets up a different relationship, both to time, both to objects, to memory. And again, with this idea that so much of history and memory has been manipulated and erased, that I don't quite see a utility either in fixed memory either. And memory is in fact not fixed. If you look at the science behind memory, right, it is always constantly being manipulated and switched. And so even something that we think happened to us, right, is mediated by the act of remembering it, right, and remembering it from where you are, as opposed to at the time that it happened. And so, yeah, I try to think about all that in terms of like, okay, if I'm talking about a quantum time capsule, how is it fundamentally different? How are the logics? How is the construction? How is it a fundamentally different thing than the sort of time capsules that, again, keep us locked out of history, don't have a legibility in terms of Black people's place on a certain kind of timeline. So yeah, I think it's challenging for folks to think about that. Like, okay, if it's not about preservation, what is it about? But I would encourage you to read the book more, because I think it's all in a particular kind of context. And the last thing I'll say is, going back to where some of these time capsules are meant to be opened. No, and I talk about that in my book as well, in terms of like, again, these sort of time capsules that were buried underneath these housing sites. I found like a whole series of them. Like there's like 6 or 7 across the country, of these different kinds of time capsules that were buried underneath these affordable housing sites. And if you're thinking about that, right, these things weren't meant to be found necessarily. The reason why they were found is because these homes were destroyed and people were displaced and they became dilapidated, and they had to actually knock down those houses. And so if you're thinking about the people who actually buried that time capsule at the time, they weren't thinking ahead to be like, oh, well, 50 years from now, this will be dilapidated, and so people will be able to find these time capsules. But there was a different reason, one that I don't know necessarily, but there's a different reason why they buried them, with that expectation that they aren't going to be found necessarily, ever, hopefully, right? If this housing construct stands and is used, into future generations. So yeah, I think, I don't have specific answers to some of the questions that you asked, but just trying to share how I think about it, and why preservation isn't necessarily the goal, the foremost goal, when it comes to a quantum time capsule as we've thought about them.
Thanks so much. It also really makes me think about inscription, as I said earlier, but also encryption, because we were talking about legibility earlier. So it's maybe also proof of existence without clear legibility that is important there. But I'll pass on to Nelly.
Yes, I'll make it short. Thank you that's a great question. I just want to say, so because I said this earlier, I think, because I think, what capsule invokes first and foremost is something like, yeah, as you said, containment, and like, I guess also like sealed, and like separation from the then to the now, stuff like that. And that's why I also said, for me, it kind of represented also the break or the rupture, whatever, because I think in the work of Black Quantum Futurism, it really is, or becomes a device that kind of, I said this earlier, I think makes past and future kind of bleed into each other. And then kind of it's an encapsulation that weaponizes against its own logic, so to say, if you know what I mean. So in the work, right? So that's what's really interesting to me there. And then apart from that, on the containment question, I mean, containment also, I think about quarantine and isolation and stuff like that. It's also, right, connected to that. And I think that's really how colonial time operates, I guess. And to me, this kind of connection to sickness, let's say, would be also how I guess colonial time containment creates pathology. So that is like connected to that for me a lot. And then just maybe 2 sentences on Ursula Le Guin's, carrier bag theory. What is the difference there? If we talk about the container and container for gathering and stuff like that, to me what it invokes or what it implies and what it brings is collectivity. You do it for, a group, and then also the nurturing of the technology. And with that come a ton of other things, but I don't want to talk too much.
Thank you very much. We actually have to come to an end soon, but I'm stretching the time space for a moment because I want to take Natalie's comment.
I wanted to, I guess I'll make it a question and a comment and just like a point. But I'm just thinking if you guys maybe could a little bit elaborate on then, you know, as you spoke about time and functionality or can come into being. I'm just wondering then also about, since we're talking about time, because I just be loud. But since we're talking about time capture, I'm thinking about linearity also. So because you spoke about not necessarily. Hello. Hello.
No, I think there's a funkloch. You can speak in, I can repeat it for Rasheedah. Yeah.
So I was saying, since you're talking about time, I'm wondering about linearity because Rasheedah spoke about the possibility that some capsules didn't have to be open. And I think that when you think, like, I guess in the classical way, right, it's like you make it, you close it, you open it one day. And that's a kind of linear thinking also when engaging with time capsules and that kind of containment. So I'm also, I guess, just asking about how you're or you know different formats of time. So now also creating also like now creating a new articulation how you would even engage a time capsule because you have to consider is it linear or non-linear. This already is happening on a very not then the rules and the techniques and the application of how you engage these future technologies or past technologies becomes this interesting mesh. And I don't know if you could just say anything on linearity and like scale.
So the question was how, in relation to time capsules, how linearity comes into play as engagement with time capsules doesn't necessarily happen on a linear mode, as we were talking about the fact that they don't necessarily have to be open, and we engage from different, like also temporal positionalities with other different temporal positionalities. So the question was if there, or what are the alternative frameworks of time that kind of suspend linearity that you work with, as in, for example, CPT, but also kind of like non-linear movements or networked movements in and about time that you work with. And maybe we can also make that question your final statement, if you don't mind. So what are the outlooks into how do we move through time in nonlinear ways, and is there a particular moment or maybe example that you are ready to share with us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Not to keep referring back to my book, but why not? I give lots of different examples in my book about different ways that different communities engage with space and time and different traditions, different rituals, different ways of observing space-time that have emerged in different kinds of cultures, in particular in the Afro diaspora. And so, you know, just one concrete example is just how particular communities think about time not as this sort of Gregorian calendar, but it might be based on market time. It might be based on festivals and particular rituals that happen in that community. And that is when time is counted from, right? The time of the next ritual, the time of the next festival, the time of the next market. And that market it doesn't necessarily fall on a specific calendar day. It is about, you know, seasons, right? It may be about something in the environment. So there's lots of different ways that communities observe time that is not based on Western linearity. And there are some that do, right? And you know, there's not like one sort of, I think I'm not making the argument that, right, like, linearity doesn't or shouldn't exist. I think there are a lot of cultures that do practice linearity, but do it in ways that aren't necessarily tied to capitalism and to sort of the work clock and sort of, you know, moving into a future that is, you know, controlled, authorized by someone else. So I talk about a lot of different community practices, and then also talk about, you know, because I am a Black American person. I grew up in America. I do not feel comfortable co-opting or just adapting a practice just because I'm like, oh, that looks cool, right? Like that to me is committing the same sort of things that colonialism has done to us. But it is about reviving and sort of understanding and coming to terms with that there are other ways of being, and then looking to my own community to talk about and think about, like, what are those rituals of time, rituals of survival, other ways of being in time, whether it's around language, whether it's around how we come together in community, the kind of family reunions we have, and how we celebrate through, family reunions. That was always a ritual in my own family in terms of like how we got together, how we thought about time, how we, the time I would see my grandmother again, like those kinds of things. And one of the things that I talk about in particular, this is not at all my theory. This is a theory that emerged from a scholar named Geneva Smitherman, but talking about how we use the word be in the Black community. Like be, for example, I'm a be at this place, right? It's not a thing that is specific in time, right? Like it's the way that we use it in our community and in our culture. It sort of transcends a specific time in terms of like a state of being, right? And so if you say I'm gonna be somewhere, that doesn't mean like you're going to be there at a specific date and time, but it could be sort of a perpetuality of things. So that's just one example that I talk about in the book. And then I also talk about, for example, Harriet Tubman and how she was able to manipulate space and time, whether it's how she moved, whether it was, hiding in the river, in the water, waiting out the smell of hounds, right? Choosing to take certain routes at night because time moved more slowly during that time at night, right? So just these relationships to our environment and different kinds of relationships to different kinds of time. And again, not just taking the clock time for granted. And that could be anything. That could be any number of practices, activities. And so I try to name a few in the book in terms of ones that have emerged in my community and communities of people that I've worked with doing art, doing housing work, organizing work. I talk about that in the book as well, how working with organizers, particularly around housing issues, has pushed possibility for what is possible for a future, for at least for me, particularly as a housing advocate and a lawyer who was trained a very certain way in terms of linearity and the law and like what is possible based on what has come before, and then organizers working with organizers, and they totally disrupt that to try to get to a vision of the future that they see as possible, even if others don't. So I give lots of different examples in the book in more detail, and even if you don't buy the book, there's like a lot of stuff, a lot of my writings and stuff are online as well.
Oh, you read it downstairs. Thanks so much. I'll give it to you, Nelly, for a closing.
I know we're pressing time, so I'll be quick. Yeah, thank you for the question. A lot of what Rasheedah said resonates a lot with, what I would have said. Maybe so I will make it quick and maybe offer like 3 different things. So I think one thing is that linear time to me. And I mean, we talked about this earlier a little bit, right? We talked about progress. So I think the linear time of progress, for example, narrates something like resistance as accumulation, right? And so I think that's a very kind of dangerous idea, that if we think, it's like a slow but steady process, and if we just wait and we play by the book and within the system, then we will arrive at a certain point where all the reforms will work, I think that's like one thing where, that's what the narrative of linear time is, and where it plays out in that way, that it really kind of conditions a whole mass of people. I think that would be one thing for me. I think what nonlinear time does is reveal history as unfinished. And that opens up the possibility of connecting our current struggles with all the different things that have happened in history. And I don't think that everything has always needs to be connected in whatever way. I really think about this also in a probably very Deleuze-Guattari sense, but also Glissantien sense, where they talk about the rhizome, right? And there's a lot of, like, it's a root system, but there's lots of kinds of like strands that also die down. They don't lead anywhere, but there's a lot of connection as well, right? That also goes through generations in that sense. So to me, if I think about nonlinear time, for example, that would be one very specific kind of instance, I guess, where that affects a lot of my practice as well, and a lot of my, like, how I kind of, I guess, try to condition myself to be in this world and do my political work, for example, right? And then the last thing I wanted to say, wait, I wrote it down. Yes, so that would be the last thing. What comes out of that to me is how the amplification happens, then is through resonance, I would say. So if we recognize that the current struggle connects to a long history of resistance, that changes also the whole effective register of how we can kind of, I guess, relate in these struggles and really just be in the world, I guess, That's my last sentence, how we can be in the world, so that's it. I have much more, we can talk about this later. Yeah.
Thank you, the two of you, so much for sharing your thoughts, your resonances, your practices. Thanks for being such an attentive and patient audience. It was a beautiful rhizomatic conversation.
Thank you for the wonderful moderation.
Thanks to Civa for having us. And there is a lecture performance following this session and an AV performance at night. And the exhibition is on until February 1st, and you can also visit it for free this weekend, so come back and be sure not to miss the work of Black Quantum Futurism, as well as reading into Rasheedah's book and buying it, and also looking at all the other work in the exhibition, and looking up all the references you've heard in the last 1.5 hours. Have fun for the next 5 years, and have a lovely evening, and thanks.
Thank you also. Thank you, Djamila.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. And Nelly, thank you for all the book recommendations, like 20 now that I have to get. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rasheedah. Bye. Take care.